In this lesson, we'll start to work on the lighting for our aircraft scene. Okay, so we're going to be jumping back to this project that we were working on earlier in our course. So now that we've had a chance to explore a lot of the lighting tools and a lot of the lighting and rendering features, now we're ready to start putting these to some practical use in this project. So if you take a look at what we have currently, if I were to render this out, you can see at the moment I really have no lighting that's been set up at this point. One thing that I do have currently set up is in my quality. I have my sampling level set to 0. Really, the settings that we have here are what we would get if I were to just load up the default settings. And again, as I mentioned in an earlier lesson, I like to start with these sampling levels nice and low, so that way I can keep my renders moving quickly and get my feedback as quickly as possible. Okay, so let's start with the overall lighting of this scene. So we have this shot, and it's sort of this sky fueling station. So we're going to have an environment that is sort of a sky and clouds and things like that. So to load this up, let's go into Mental Ray, make sure that we are using that as our renderer. Let's go to Indirect Lighting, and let's create an image-based lighting environment. So hit Create. It's going to create this image-based lighting shape, which if at any point in time, if we ever need to get back to this, a quick and easy way would be to go to something like the Hypershade. And with the Hypershade loaded up, if we go over into the Lights tab, here's our Mental Ray IBL, or Image-Based Lighting Environment. You'll notice that this environment that we create is actually considered to be a light source inside of Maya. So to make this work, we need to plug in some sort of an image. So let's go ahead and browse. And if you take a look inside the source images directory, we have this clouds environment. So let's go ahead and load this up. Give this just a moment. There we go. And now let's render this out and just see what we have. All right, you can start to see maybe just a little bit of a hint of some clouds back here. If I were to come in and scrub through my timeline, if you look closely, you can see our image-based lighting environment back here. It's sort of this yellow wireframe. But as I move the camera back, there we are. We can actually see sort of this background here. So at the moment, this is really just acting like a background for us. Now, what we can also do is use this image-based lighting environment as a way of providing illumination to the scene. So rather than trying to set up lights that mimic sort of this blue illumination color from the sky, we can actually just use this image itself directly. Okay, so to do this, let's go back into our render settings. Inside this indirect lighting tab, we'll turn on this feature called Final Gathering. Now, Final Gathering is really just a way of simulating indirect illumination in the scene. And if we use Final Gathering together with this image-based lighting environment, we can start to get lighting that appears to be coming from this sky and providing, again, proper illumination to this. Now, in most situations, this is sort of a little side note for you, but in most situations, we probably would not use a basic JPEG image for this. We would normally want to use, for this image-based lighting environment, some kind of a high dynamic range image, something that has a lot of lighting information in that. Again, that's a topic for another course, and if you would like to learn more about image-based lighting and high dynamic range images, or HDR images, we actually do have a number of courses that talk about that. But for this situation, because we have such soft lighting and really no major light sources to try to simulate light from, this JPEG environment should work okay for us. Okay, so I'm going to turn on Final Gathering. And one last thing I'm going to turn on is if we go back to the Common tab, scroll down all the way to the bottom underneath the render options, I'm going to disable this default light. So now if I come back and re-render that, you'll notice now that because of the Final Gathering, it is going to take a little bit longer to calculate the illumination because now it's trying to calculate some lighting that's coming from different directions. But once this finishes up, now we actually have in this scene a little bit closer match to the illumination. So the Final Gathering is trying to simulate the color of the surrounding environment. So we're getting a little bit of white from these clouds, but primarily it's going to be blue from this sky in the environment, and you can see what a difference that makes from what we had before to what we have now. And the final gathering, you can see, also starts to try and incorporate some shadows and things like that from where it believes the light direction and light intensities should be. Again, that's all based on this environment that we have plugged in. Now, one thing that you will notice is that we still have these little sort of gray planes back here. And this is the planes that we set up in one of our earlier dynamics lessons. These are the planes that are emitting these sort of smoke particles. So let's try to get rid of those in the render. So let's see if we can't grab those. It might be a little bit easier if I turn on my dynamics selections mask. There we go. That makes these little planes a little bit easier to select. And what we're going to do is go to this shape node for these objects. Go to the render stats, and just like what we looked at in our previous lesson, we're going to disable the primary visibility on these pieces of geometry. So what that should do now is pretty much make those invisible to the camera. And now we no longer see those. Okay, so compared to what we had before, this is now starting to look pretty nice, and you can see this image-based lighting environment starts to do a really, really nice job with just one simple, easy little click. So really, really nice and easy way of starting to incorporate something into a photographic environment. Now, one thing that we are missing, though, is some sort of a direct lighting source. This image-based lighting environment really doesn't do a very good job of simulating a very, very bright, direct light source like the sun. So a lot of times, even though we use this image-based lighting environment, typically we will have to add some additional lights on top of this. So I'm going to try to create a light that sort of mimics the sun. So a perfect light for that would be our directional light. So let's come in here and try to grab that. Scale that up a little bit just to make this a little bit easier to see. The size of this light makes no impact whatsoever on its rendered appearance. So what I'll try to do is get this light sort of angled in the proper direction. Alright, and make sure that we are still looking through this shot cam. I'll go ahead and turn on ray trace shadows for this light. And let's render this out. Okay, and now you can start to see that we do have kind of a nice strong sunlight type light source, and you can start to see now some of the shadows that are coming from that. Now I might try to angle this light a little bit differently, again just for my personal preference, and try to make the light seem like it's coming down at a little bit stronger angle here. Okay, very nice. So that's now a little bit better angle, at least I feel that that's a little bit better angle for my personal taste here. There we go. So now one last thing that I might do is to try to come in and maybe add a little bit of a fill light to this little backside here. It does feel a little bit dark back here. So it's easy to come in here and create maybe something like a little bit of a point light. There we go, and maybe just pull this underneath. And again, just sort of use this to provide just a little bit of extra illumination back here. This is probably going to be a really, really subtle light source. Okay, and that just, again, sort of provides just a little bit of extra illumination and a little bit more of a fill light sort of back here toward the back. One thing that we also want to keep in mind is that if we don't enable shadows on a light source, that means that the light will just continue to pass right on through any objects. So even though we have our light that's sort of positioned back here, the light, because it is not currently using any shadows, may pass right through the engines, pass right through the side, and start to provide maybe some unwanted illumination into these areas. It can also, because it is going right through geometry, can start to kill some of the shadows that we already have. Again, because without shadows to stop it, there's nothing to prevent that light from reaching some of these shadowed areas. So always a good idea to make sure that you come in, and even with these soft, subtle lights, make sure that you use some sort of a shadow. So that way you can make sure that that light, again, isn't providing illumination to some of these unwanted areas. Okay, and now you can see with the shadows enabled, what a difference that does make. So before, we just had the illumination itself from this little point light, but now that we have shadows on here, we can make sure that, again, light's not reaching some of these unwanted areas and giving us highlights and hot spots and things like that in areas where they really shouldn't be. Okay, so for the most part, this is starting to look pretty good. So in our next lesson, we'll start to look at the process of fine-tuning some of the lighting and also taking a look at a really useful feature in Maya called the attribute spreadsheet.